until cities will allow much more construction, there will still be a lot of need for flexible and shared housing. And I think even if more supply will start to suddenly appear out of the air in, let's say, San Francisco and New York, by the time that it gets here, the market's expectations would have been so different that people anyway would want something that is much more service and flexible, and a more reasonable way to secure an apartment, just like you get any other product. So not like get an empty thing and go through a broker and spend like months like looking at 40 different apartments every time you want to move, but have something that is ready for you with everything connected and hopefully with some nice people. So I'm still a great believer in co-living, and just like before, it doesn't mean that everything will work. You have to choose the right locations. You have to keep an eye on your budget. You have to be nice to your customers, but there's definitely reason to remain bullish.
Hello everybody, Christine here with another fun episode of the Co-Living Code Show. I'm also the founder of Kndrd, which is software for this industry. And today we brought back on Dror Poleg. And what's funny is he just came on January 1st of this year, but I begged him to come back on because obviously a lot is changing in the world, especially when it comes to real estate. He is the author of Rethinking Real Estate and the co-chair of the Urban Land Institute Technology and Innovation Council in New York. His insights on the future of cities and buildings have been featured in publications including the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, NBC, and Forbes. Dror briefs and advises senior executives from multi-billion-dollar companies such as AvalonBay Communities, British Land, Liberty Mutual, Dubai Holding, and Cushman Wakefield. He spent the last 20 years working at the intersection of technology and the built world in Beijing, Melbourne, Tel Aviv, London, and New York. So he has tons of experience. And just like I mentioned in January, please pick up his book, Rethinking Real Estate. It is like the Bible of all types of real estate. And we definitely talk a lot about the future of co-living. So enjoy this special episode, bringing back on Dror Poleg, the author of Rethinking Real Estate. So this week we are bringing back Dror Poleg. He was actually the author of this amazing book, Rethinking Real Estate. It came out last November. He was kind enough to send me a copy right around when we interviewed last. He came on the show on January 1st, New Year's Day of this year. So I know it's quick to bring you back on, but obviously it's the end of May and a lot is going on in real estate during COVID. So Dror, welcome back to the show. We're excited to have you again.
Thank you, Christine. Yes, it does feel like a lifetime since we last talked, but it wasn't so long ago, right?
Wasn't so long ago. So it's funny, what's so great about your book is that, you made all these predictions about how real estate was going to shift. Again, on this interview, we're going to talk about real estate as a whole. So office, industrial, retail, co-living, residential. But these predictions, it seems like they're happening even quicker now that COVID, it's accelerating them. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel the same?
Yeah, definitely. So I think most of the stuff that's predicted in the book is happening now, and it's happening faster than even I expected. And I think even though it's happening, a lot of people in the real estate world are still in denial a little bit. I mean, they're much happier focusing on like the extreme short term and what you need to do about COVID, not so excited to think about, okay, once COVID is behind us, what will the world look like? And they're all trying to convince themselves that, okay, everything will just go back to how it was, but I don't think it will.
No, and let's start there. I think the office space is going to be the most difficult to kind of get back into the game. How do you think they're going to do that? What's going to shift as far as like space as a service, co-working spaces, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, even before talking about COVID, there's just an economic slowdown at the moment, and a lot of companies kind of got a bit shell-shocked by a sudden drop in demand for their services. And that both made them reconsider whether they need a lot of the stuff that they have, and whether it's office space or even the type of employees that they have or the locations that they chose to open branches in. But also wait, what was I saying? But also it's like...
The shell shock of what happened.
Yeah, sorry. So they got shell-shocked. And, but also for landlords, I think short term, it looks like people might need a little more space, if at all. I mean, assuming that they come back to the office, if they'll want more space between people. So people really like to focus on that idea. But I think more broadly, it's clear that people who weren't comfortable signing a lease a year ago and needed flexibility back then and didn't want to invest in a build out and, in buying their own furniture and really wanted something more as a service, they're much less likely to want to make those types of commitments now or even in a year or two. So, I mean, in that sense, the trends that were already in place have been expedited, and I think have expanded from a group of early adopters to, I think, a much broader audience. Uh, Likewise, for working from home, or at least working partly remotely, a lot of people who maybe didn't want to consider this possibility or considered it, but only theoretically, now have a clear proof of what works and what doesn't work. It doesn't mean that all of them are convinced that they should all work from home now, but it does mean that those of them who had the potential to work from home now know that they can. And I think for at least some of them, they will not go back to the old model and the old way of doing things.
Yeah, and then I know one of your articles you talked about productivity in the workplace versus at home. So do you think now people are even more productive working from home because they're kind of, being able, less of a commute, less time spent on getting to work, and maybe there's a hybrid model of them doing their home stuff and their work stuff? Like,
So I think obviously working from home is not for everyone. And I think the future of office, even in the most radical vision, is not everyone suddenly working from home. But there's a broad spectrum between home and the office as we know it. So even if people want to work near home, or they want to work in all sorts of other spaces like satellite spaces throughout the city, that still creates a big challenge for traditional office landlords. So what seems to be clear and clear is that the idea of everyone going to the same place 9 to 5 days a week, we're going to see less and less of that. Whether how many of them are going to stay home, how many of them are going to go to the old office and how frequently, and how many are going to go to all sorts of new places, we'll have to wait and see, but I'm sure it will be different from how it was a year ago. Yeah, so I mean, and in terms of productivity, we're seeing already a lot of people that are happier at home and are more productive at home. But there's two issues with that. One, they might get tired of it in a few months. And particularly once other people go back to the office, I think those that are at home might find that they don't like being home so much as before, because they're getting left out of meetings and all sorts of processes proceed without them. So it's actually much easier to work from home when everyone's at home. It's much harder when people start moving around. Uh, but that brings me to a second point where, in order to really allow people to be productive at home, organizations have to adopt all sorts of new ways of working. So not just to take the way they worked at the office and just assume that some people will do the same thing elsewhere, but to create a new way of working that allows people not necessarily to be present in the same space, which means to rely more on asynchronous ways of doing things. So not someone creates something, other people can comment on it, more stuff being done in writing, more stuff being recorded and organized in ways that are easy for people to access from different time zones and the different times of the day. And also different ways of measuring performance of employees and keeping them accountable. So not just assuming that, okay, the fact that I saw you here for 9 hours today means that you're like really making a great effort, to a different way of measuring things. So, and all of that, I think the tenants themselves are already adopting and experimenting with new tools. So, I mean, every tenant that we've seen make announcements over the last couple of months said that they're going to use less office space and they're going to use it differently. It's the landlords who've been doubting, saying like, oh no, it's just a fad, it's not going to happen. Show me the facts, where's the evidence? But the tenants themselves, the tenant is telling you something. Like, what else do you need to hear?
yeah, or maybe they're just, maybe it's like they haven't taken it in yet, right? Like, oh no,
Yeah.
what are we going to do with the buildings? And so to that point, I know Apple created their Apple Park, they just finished it recently, $5 billion to build it. Facebook, Google, they're all saying, oh, you can work from home. But then obviously all the perks that they got, working, like all the meals, everything, do you think, how's that going to play out? Like, is there going to be a decrease in salary if they move out of the Bay Area to a less expensive city? Like, I mean, that's a big exodus that could happen.
Yeah. So, I mean, a few points there. I think they built the space that they need for right now. These companies are growing very fast. So, I mean, Facebook specifically, I think, had like 16,000 employees 3 or 4 years ago. Now they have 47 or 50,000. So there's 3 times more employees. So even if assuming they keep growing at this rate, let's say for just a few more years, they will still need a lot more space. The question is if they'll need as much as they needed before, mostly about the space that they didn't take yet. So I mean, to just look at leases that they signed, I don't know if that's an indication. Also, these companies, the percentage that they spend on rent and then even on employees is a much smaller percentage of their overall revenue compared to most other businesses on earth, which is good news on the way up, because it means that they don't really care how much they spend, which is why they built all these really expensive offices. And, we see Google and Facebook and Amazon taking the best office buildings in New York and in other cities. But it's also bad on the way down, where, even though they signed those leases, if they don't think they need those spaces, they'll be like, okay, whatever, let's just write it off and move on. Maybe we'll keep paying rent, maybe we'll try to sublease it. But I don't think, they're not going to force everyone to come back to the office for the next 10 years just because they signed a lease. So if they realize that there's a different way to work, they're going to figure out how to get rid of those leases, or how to just use them for whatever it is they planned before, but not expand further. In terms of the salary gap, yeah, there was a lot of outrage about that. Okay, what Facebook is just using it as a way to cut people's salaries if they move to a different city. But actually, all employers on earth already pay people differently based on where they live, including the federal government, by the way. So, yeah, if you want to make a New York City salary while living, on a mountain in, Kazakhstan, then maybe if you're really good, then fine. But I think just for the companies that hire tens of thousands of people and just that have uniform salaries, I think it makes sense for them to pay a little differently to different people based on locations. And maybe more importantly, it's a competitive market. Whatever people get paid is based on supply and demand. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't decide what people get paid. He would be happy to pay everyone much less even now in San Francisco. So if it was up to him, it would be lower. So, he's just going to do whatever he can get away with, and probably can get away with less if people live outside of San Francisco.
I know. Speaking of Mark Zuckerberg, I loved your recent title. Again, yeah, I know. I loved your recent post. Landlords are zucked. You're super clever on the title. So again, anybody watching or listening, other than picking up his book, which is like the Bible of real estate and technology, of all types of real estate, is get on his weekly e-newsletter for sure. It's one of my favorites. I read every week. Just amazing outlook on the future of real estate and what's going on now. And your book, I failed to mention, it's great that you made almost like a history, it was like part history lesson throughout the book. Every chapter started with a history lesson, on that chapter specifically, whether it was commercial real estate, residential. What I found the most interesting was, I think in the early 1900s in New York, let me see, I jotted it down. It was Ansonia was the building that they were using space as a service. So they allowed nightly, weekly, monthly, or an annual residence in that one building, correct?
Yeah, and they also had a lot of shared amenities, a shared dining room, a shared kitchen, shared laundry rooms. They had a shared communal farm on the roof with actual livestock that the government shut down after a few years. So yeah, a lot of the things that we see now have happened before.
Yeah, and again, that was almost like a modern day co-living, right? Back then. Mm-hmm. So jumping over, so we'd be amiss if we didn't talk about co-living right now during COVID. Sure. On the Co-Living Code show. What are your thoughts about, what's going to happen post-COVID with co-living?
I think here too, if the whole world is becoming more dynamic, if people move more, if the employment market is becoming more flexible, I think that calls for living solutions that are more flexible and at least are more kind of on demand. It doesn't mean that people will live in a different city every week, but it does mean that, they don't want to carry their stuff with them every time they move, even within a city. I think that cities, one thing that's expediting, that this virus is expediting, is also the move out of the city of people that maybe didn't plan to stay there for many more years anyhow. Even people like me, I'm now in the suburbs for the last couple of months. I just turned 40. I have a wife and a daughter, and I always hated the suburbs, but now I'm here and I'm like, okay, actually this is kind of nice. Maybe it's time for me to move out of the city. And I think that there are many other people like me, which doesn't mean that the city will be empty. It means that more young people will come to the city. But still, the apartment that I'm going to vacate is probably too expensive for them. So they'll need even more solutions that are shared and flexible for them. And even beyond people like me, the real rich people of New York, are kind of have been moving out, or the market has been softening for a couple of years now. But these are apartments that cost $10 million, and now they cost $8.5 million. So that doesn't really make the city much more affordable. So until cities will allow much more construction, there will still be a lot of need for flexible and shared housing. And I think even if more supply will start to suddenly appear out of the air in, let's say, San Francisco and New York, by the time that it gets here, the market's expectations would have been so different that people anyway would want something that is much more service and flexible, and a more reasonable way to secure an apartment, just like you get any other product. So not like get an empty thing and go through a broker and spend like months like looking at 40 different apartments every time you want to move, but have something that is ready for you with everything connected and hopefully with some nice people. So I'm still a great believer in co-living, and just like before, it doesn't mean that everything will work. You have to choose the right locations. You have to keep an eye on your budget. You have to be nice to your customers, but there's definitely reason to remain bullish.
And, I don't know, do you have any kind of future
I can't
projection?
hear you,
Oh, you
Christine.
can't. You can't
Yeah,
hear
now
me?
I can.
Okay.
I can now.
Perfect. Sorry about that. So, do you have any future projections on vacancy rates? So, obviously, we're running at 98% occupied across the US for residential real estate. Do you think that that's going to decrease? Everybody's kind of staying where they're at because they can't move right now. But do you think that will start shifting?
Oh, so you mean for housing specifically?
Yeah,
Yeah, or
residential housing. Yeah.
for I think there'll be a period, a period of transition. I don't know if it will affect the total occupancy, but definitely some places will see some vacancy and some other places will see a surge in demand. I mean, the people are not disappearing. They all need a place to stay. So it will not be very dramatic on the whole, but I think within cities and between cities, we're going to see quite a lot of shifts. Within cities, I think that even people that live, again, where I live, I still need to take the subway to the office, and it takes me like 30 minutes at least, which means like at least 1 hour a day commuting, and usually more like an hour and a half or even an hour 45. I'm tired of that, and I think a lot of people are as well. So I would rather work somewhere closer to home, and or move to a neighborhood that actually allows me to live and walk to the office, but not in the center of Manhattan in Midtown, because that would be too expensive, and also it's not a very pleasant place to live. So I think in the cities that allow it, we'll see the emergence of smaller centers that are walkable, that allow people a slightly different lifestyle than the one they had before. And I think between cities as well, there'll be more people that maybe are tired of New York and San Francisco, but still want to live in an urban environment. They don't want to live in a house in a suburb that, that they have to drive everywhere. They want to be somewhere walkable, somewhere a bit like a college town. And I think we'll see some people move to these places uh, as well. But the residential market moves slowly, so I mean, we can keep an eye on it. I'm not going to predict today anything very dramatic. So.
Okay, nothing dramatic
Yeah.
yet. I did take some questions. Again, you were a guest that everybody brings up. They loved your first interview that we did. So I took a couple questions. Guy Puri, he's super active in co-living. He wanted to ask, what's something you've been thinking about, but haven't really heard people talking about yet, and that you're surprised about?
Let me open my notes for my next newsletter and see if there's anything
Ooh, I
crazy.
know. And that's what I was thinking when I read his question. I'm like, gosh, Dror sends an email every week that explains, what you're thinking about. You kind of talk about it every week.
Yeah. So, I mean, as it relates to housing in particular, I would say I was trying to think whether the city needs offices so much. Cities have existed long before offices became popular, and long before offices started dominating and defining the way cities are built and the way they look. And a lot of people currently conflate where you work with where you live. So they think that, even if people stop going to the office, it means cities are doomed. But I can imagine a city where the best companies still pay their employees to be there because that's where they want to be. And the city becomes like a playground for young people who want that density, who want to be able to date and have fun and meet new people and make connections for their career, which, older people already have. And whether those cities can actually have much more residential and rely much more on housing. And in a way, even this process, I think, has already been happening. So in New York today, it's one indicator. It's not a scientific method, but over the most of the 20th century, the tallest buildings were office buildings. So all the famous ones: the Empire State, the Chrysler Building, the World Trade Center. And actually, over the past few years, the tallest buildings that pop up in New York are all residential buildings. I mean, the 3 or 4 tallest buildings now in New York, especially those that came up over the last 10 years, are all apartment buildings. And it already shows you maybe that the city is kind of shifting towards more being a playground for people that want to live there, whether they're very, very rich and don't have to care so much about where they work, or they're young and they just want to run around and meet people and bump into people. And I think we're going to see more of that. So I mean, the office as the kind of the center and the most important thing in the city, I think might be diminishing, which doesn't mean there'll be no offices. It just means that they'll be a little less important than they were before. And living in a walkable and fun environment is going to grow in importance. This process as well, I think, will involve some pain. It's not that suddenly all the office buildings will shut down and everyone will move in and turn them into apartments. It's a very complicated process. For some cities, it will be more painful than others. But yeah, that's one big idea that I'm exploring at the moment and trying to figure out.
Yeah, no, and speaking of conversions, whether that's
No,
whether
I
that
hear you now.
on the conversions, whether that's, hotels being converted after this is said and done, or retail space or office space converting, are there any other sectors that you think are going to start converting over to residential, whether that's short-term, long-term residential?
Yeah, so retail, I think in the city, most of it, it's easy to turn it into an office. It's harder to turn it into residential in most cities. Hotels definitely, I don't know, I can't even say that they'll become apartments, but I think the boundaries between a hotel and between an apartment have been blurring also for a while. And that spectrum of like two clear things on both ends. Today, again, you can already book an apartment for 3 months or for 6 months or for 12 months, or go and sign a lease with the landlord. It's the same apartment. It's just a matter of who you actually get it from, whether it's on Airbnb or from an operator like Sonder, or from a co-living operator, or from, again, like a traditional lease. So I think that boundary will continue to blur. And I think the cities that will allow this increasing flexibility and increasing evolution will do better. So I mean, a lot of cities don't allow it at the moment because of zoning laws and because of a lot of resistance from existing residents. A lot of that resistance is warranted, and people, it's their right to worry about what happens in their neighborhood. But at the same time, if you want to continue living in a city that is dynamic and is evolving and allows new people and new things to keep growing, I think residents will have to be open-minded as well. And here too, I see some sort of an alliance between the very, very wealthy who live in the city and want it to be fun and don't care so much about the value of everyone else's apartments, because it doesn't affect the hyper expensive apartments, and the younger people that are coming to cities. So for better or worse, I think the middle class will get screwed yet again. But for people who are just renting in the city, it might be a fun outcome.
Oh boy, yeah, maybe
Yeah.
you're right on that. We'll definitely have to see how that happens. As
Because
far
the
as
young people, I think, for the ultra wealthy that live in New York, the fact that there's a lot of cool young people, it's part of the entertainment that they pay for basically by living there. So, I mean, they want to have the cool clubs and the artists and the restaurants. Yeah, they don't care so much about like the couple with 2 kids who just makes $200,000 a year. Like they're poor in New York, and the rich don't care about them,
oh my gosh,
unfortunately.
yeah, because so that everybody knows, you were in the city, and you worked from WeWork co-working space, down the street from your home, so everything was convenient. And then now, so you're still in New York, but you're up in the suburbs, right?
I actually started my transition so before this crisis. So I had an office in Midtown, a proper office. And then in August, I took a little WeWork near my home in Brooklyn because we had a new baby and I wanted to kind of go to the office, but I didn't want to commute all the way to my office. Yeah, and now I'm in the suburbs. So it's like, also for me, it's been an expedited experiment and kind of getting to feel 3 different ways of working this year. And so far, I like the last stop here, where it's quiet and I don't have to commute anywhere, and I can talk to
Nice.
you over Zoom and never leave my home. So yeah.
Exactly, right? The conveniences. So I have 2 more questions. So one is, and again, I know you mentioned WeWork, and I didn't even know this, that the new CEO is kind of shifting towards convenience. Not even talking about community anymore, maybe because now people have to be more spread out. I always co-worked for the community and partly the convenience. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so he gave an interview, I think, on CNBC a few weeks ago, which was the first time that he actually gave a public interview, I think. And they asked him, like, what about community? WeWork is all about community and people coming together. It doesn't look like a great thing in the current environment. So he said, what, community? No, like we were always about flexibility. We never, I don't know what you're talking about. So
Oh my
it
gosh.
was quite funny. So I think, yeah, I think community still matters. Personally, I always thought that it matters less for mainstream customers than flexibility and price. I think that's the main driver. And the main reason people share is because they have to share. Everyone would love to have a private apartment and then have community at the lobby. They don't have to share an apartment for that. But I think the need to share is not going away. And the need for people to connect to other people in the city is definitely not going away. People are hungry for some social interaction in person. So yeah, and I think WeWork knows that as well. They just, the new CEO just wanted to show that he's the opposite of the old CEO, but both of them
Okay.
kind of
I will have to
have a
look that up
balance.
online, that interview. I didn't see that interview. I'm curious. Yeah, the lack of convenience was, I wish there was a membership, and I think I've talked about this before because I was a member for a while. It's like one membership and I could just jump around to different locations, and they didn't have that option. So that was
A few
inconvenient.
years ago, and they eliminated it. I think they decided that they want to focus on other people, not the people who enjoy that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. So yeah, we'll watch them closely and see how that pans out for sure. And so yeah, last question, and again, thanks for coming on again, is just in just general, last thoughts about how we're gonna come out of this. What do you think about this whole COVID and how it's shifted real estate in general?
I think the biggest word that I have in my mind for real estate after this is the word choice.
Mm.
I don't think everyone will suddenly be at the office. I don't think everyone will move to the countryside. I don't think everyone will just buy everything online, but I think much more than ever before, everyone understands that they have a choice, that going to the office is a choice, that living in the city is a choice, that going to the store is a choice. So it doesn't mean that they'll stop doing those things, but it means that whoever owns and operates those buildings will have to work much harder to convince them to come back. So going to the office is no longer the default option and something that people cannot imagine living without. So you'll have to convince them why they should still come to the office. And there's many reasons why, but again, now it's the landlord and employer's responsibility to convince them. It's not something that people will take for granted.
Got
So
it. Well,
choice.
that's a perfect ending to our interview. And then again, so your book's on what's the easiest way for people to pick up your book?
Yeah, Amazon's the easiest way. You can, my website, rethinking.re, has a link to it. And even just Google it, you'll find various ways to buy it wherever books are sold.
Awesome. Highly recommend it. Again, thank you for sending me a copy. I really appreciated that. And thanks for coming on again.
Thank you, Christine. Stay well.
Yes, you too.
You
Bye-bye.
too.
Thank you so much for checking out today's episode. If you want to learn more about co-living, you could check out my book on Amazon, The Co-Living Code. And of course, if you're looking for the perfect software to power your co-living concept, check out Kndrd.io, Kndrd.io. Thanks.